Good evening and welcome to For the Record. Tonight we're talking about Fiji's human rights record. Now I understand much has been said about human rights in Fiji and the fact that a lot of new rights are now enshrined in the 2013 constitution, but we're talking about the human rights progress in Fiji in regards to the Universal Periodic Review by the United Nations. Now, this is where member states are invited to present reports on the progress of human rights in their countries, and recently Fiji had its turn. We were led our delegation was led by the Minister for Justice and Attorney General Aya Sayed Kayum. Along with him were the Chief Justice Anthony Gates, the Director of the Public Prosecutions Office Christopher Pride, Fiji's permanent representative to Geneva, Madam Ambassador Nazat Shamim, and also the chairman of the Media Industry Development Authority, Ashwin Raj. All these individuals made presentations about what the human rights situation in Fiji is. Also talking about the freedom of expression and freedom of the media. And to tell us more about this meeting in Geneva and what Fiji had to present to the UN, in studio with us we have tonight the chairman of MIDA, Ashwin Raj. Ashwin, thank you very much for making time for this interview. Just by way of background, as I had explained, the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, is progress reports by member states of the United Nations on the human rights situation. But before we get into Fiji's report or presentation, there are civil society groups who have their own session before the member states are given an opportunity to speak. At this civil society session of the UPR, NGOs make presentations about the situation in their countries, and Fiji at this recent meeting had civil society CSOs make their presentation. Did this in any way influence what the Geneva meeting perceived about the human rights situation in Fiji?
Thank you, Edwin, and good evening, Fiji. Thanks for having me on the show. Now, the civil society organizations are an important actor in the human rights landscape. And to ensure that there is parity in representation, that the UN process captures a plurality of voices, it is imperative that the civil society organizations have their say, while taking full cognizance of the fact that the state is an important actor. So, in the process, what happens is you get the civil society organizations to sort of table their shadow report, what is called a shadow report, followed by the state that presents its own report on the human rights situation.
I understand that yourself and the other members of the delegation had individual areas or specific issues to speak about. But on the whole, you and I both know that Fiji has a new constitution. There are a lot of socioeconomic rights and new Bill of Rights, which encompass a whole lot of things that weren't there before. Was this well received in Geneva?
I think if one were to do an overall assessment of Fiji's performance at the UPR, it was a huge success by all accounts. Fiji was commended for the restoration of parliamentary democracy, the fact that we had a very, very credible, successful elections. We've got a constitution which is very, very inclusive with a robust Bill of Rights. Fiji received commendation for all of these achievements. The special thing about the UPR this time around is that there's been enormous strides in securing greater rights and freedom and dignity of all Fijians compared to the last periodic review in the shadows of the 2006 event. And so in a sense, this review was important in the sense that it was to signal a fundamental shift in the human rights landscape. And so a critical appraisal at this point was necessary. And I think that the Fijian delegation was only too happy to appear before the UN to table its report, given the enormous strides that have been made in the area of human rights.
I understand presentations were made with regards to media freedom, expressions of, freedom of expression, judiciary, and the like. But I just want to get into whether the shadow report prepared by the civil society organizations, did the shadow report take into account these positive steps that you just spoke of? Did the shadow report take cognizance of that?
Yes and no, because on the one hand, there was recognition that there is a constitution in place, that there's been elections, but on the other hand, concerns were raised about the legitimacy of the constitution and so on and so forth, which is their prerogative. And the argument was that on numerous accounts, it was premised on misinformation, and which is something that I'm happy to deconstruct, later in the course of our discussion. But the reason why, and I think this is very important, the reason why the delegation comprised of such a diverse group of people was to not only show that Fiji is seriously committed to the UPR process and strengthening of the human rights landscape, but the plurality of the delegation also is a testament to the fact that it is about the independence of the institution. So the judiciary is independent of the government. The DPP and the police are independent institutions. The Media Industry Development Authority is an independent institution. So it's very, very important that those of us who head these institutions made a statement for ourselves, as opposed to the state speaking for us.
When we talk about the judiciary, the claims that were most commonly made were that the judiciary is compromised, it is state controlled, the appointment of judges and magistrates is a compromise in itself and is a control method, and also the control over the budget of the judiciary. Was that adequately addressed, and did the UN receive this, and did they agree with this?
Oh, absolutely, and we had to clarify that because to us the concern was that this was something which was emanating from the shadow report, as well as the questions that came at the interactive dialogue, and we had to sort of kind of debunk any kind of myth around the lack of independence of our judiciary. Now, we had to clarify that our constitution expressly provides for the independence of the judiciary, in the sense that first of all, the appointment of the judges is in line with the UN basic principles. There's no requirement for the judiciary to be elected, they're appointed. They do not require the parliament to be involved in the appointment process, as this runs the risk of the judiciary becoming too aligned to the political leanings of the parliament. The other thing is that the judiciary is in terms of the administration of the judiciary, there is no interference from the executive, in the sense that the judiciary controls its own budget. So these are some very, very significant steps outlined in our constitution to ensure that the judiciary is independent.
All right, Ashwin, we have to take a quick break.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to For the Record. We're speaking with the MIDA chairman, Ashwin Raj, about Fiji's recent presentation to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review about Fiji's human rights progress. Ashwin, before the break, you were talking about the independence of the judiciary. I understand a lot of Fiji's presentations and justifications or explanations would have been based on the constitution, because that is the very crux of all the rights in Fiji, not just human rights, but everything there is to do with every Fiji citizen. So my question is, how much of what interaction took place was in relation to the Constitution, and how much did we rely on the Constitution, or did the Fiji delegation rely on the Constitution?
Yeah. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and so in a sense the message that we wanted to send was that these are not simply or merely putative claims of the state. They are written in our laws, and we wanted to make an evidence-based, fact-based intervention so that the people could read the Constitution for themselves. We alerted them to the relevant sections of the Constitution that ensure, for instance, the independence of the judiciary, that secure and recognize freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, thought, freedom of the press. So in a sense, the Bill of Rights, for instance, there was some, misnomer about, parity in gender. And there was a recommendation that, we need to recognize that in our Constitution. And we had to say, well, please read the Bill of Rights. It's actually there. So in a sense, the most important thing for us was to actually go back to our Constitution, because this is the paramount document. The rights are clearly stipulated in here, and it's enforceable by law.
Well, we had a situation pre-elections where people were being misinformed about the Constitution. There was a whole lot of rumors being spread about what's in the Constitution and what the risks were. Did you find a similar situation at the UN? We're talking about the United Nations. Was that also happening there?
Oh, absolutely. And it was glaring in the sense that, there were several questions. One was about repealing certain laws, which in fact had been repealed a long time ago. For instance, the Juveniles Act, pertaining to sort of corporal punishment, or the administration of justice decree. Now, these things were repealed a long time ago, and I was absolutely, shocked that some of the NGO members, hadn't taken full cognizance of these developments in our law. And it's imperative that, people who are going to go out and do civic education and human rights education actually know what the law says. And there's a fundamental difference between reading them as facts and interpreting them where one's own political or ideological disposition comes in the way and one does a very subjective reading. For me, I have a huge problem with people who would interpret these things in a particular way and then decide that it doesn't suit their politics, therefore the public shouldn't know. The public has the right to know, and for any person who's going to be engaged in human rights education, they need to actually tell the public what the law says, literally.
Not the interpretation.
Not the interpretation. The interpretation is something which is subject to debate. But the issue here is this. If human rights educators don't have confidence in the laws of the land, if they don't recognize the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which is fundamental to any discussion on human rights, then we've got a huge problem. Or because their interpretation has been tainted by their own ideological disposition, and therefore they decide, we're not going to promote this particular sort of bill or this particular aspect of the Constitution only because it doesn't suit our agenda or our politics, then we're doing a great disservice to the public. Because Fijians, all Fijians, deserve to know exactly what the law says, which is why I keep saying that the media must play an important role in educating the public about what the laws are, what their rights are, and for a media to be able to do that, they need to be educated themselves.
Let's come to the media later. The very nature of civil society organizations, non-government organizations, is to pick out loopholes and to point out, glaring issues that may well be what they were doing in Geneva, as they would say.
One of the reasons why Fiji was commended at the UPR was our absolute, apolitical approach to the UPR. We didn't go in defensive. We actually read out the relevant laws, from our Constitution and all the other relevant documents to say this is exactly what our position is. For instance, there was this argument that, the Bill of Rights seems to be very, very sort of kind of forward-looking, robust, but then just when you think that you're materializing 1, 2, 3, 4, there are all these limitations imposed. Well, we had to go back and say to them, these are justifiable limitations that you'll see in the laws of other countries as well.
What is a justifiable limitation in the Bill of Rights?
For instance, let's take the example of freedom of expression. Now, while the Constitution recognizes your right to expression, your freedom of expression, it's also limited on the grounds of hate speech in the interest of public order, security, to ensure that we respect the dignity of others, so on and so forth. This is something which is not peculiar to Fiji. Fiji is not a state of exception. For instance, the freedom of association, in the interest, it's limited in the order of, in the interest of public order, safety, security, so on and so forth. So in that sense, these are justifiable limitations which don't make Fiji a state of exception. And we had to clarify that. And I'll give you more examples, particularly from my area, in the area of sort of, press freedom, perhaps in a later segment. But what we wanted to say was, look, so as much as it is the job of the NGOs to sort of keep the government in check, it needs to be done within the bounds of reason. And they need to exercise scopic reason. By scopic reason, I mean reason which is untroubled by perspective. Now, in the interpretation of the Constitution, Section 3.1 of our Constitution says that anyone who is interpreting or applying our Constitution must promote the spirit, purpose, and objects of the Constitution as a whole, and the values that underlie a democratic society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom. So one can't selectively read the Constitution exactly because Section 3.1 of the Constitution says it must underpin the democratic, values of society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom.
All right. Civil rights and political rights are also an issue, a part of human rights, some would say. Last question for this segment. Fiji hasn't exactly had the best record with civil and political rights in previous years. Things have changed now. The ball game has changed entirely after the elections. But surely the Geneva meeting would have had some issues with the past that we have come from. We did not have a democratically elected government. Political rights were suppressed for quite a few years.
Several things. The position of the Fijian delegation is that you cannot have civil and political rights without social and economic rights. I contend with the fact that the question of civil rights and civil and political rights has been at the core of democratic struggles in Fiji. There's no denying that. But at the same time, the fact that the Constitution calls for, common and equal citizenry is actually something that marks an important epistemological rupture from the old, identitarian politics that was seen as civil and political rights, which was really, down to the question of race. Now, the fact that we have moved towards a post-racial future, it's not even non-racial. I want to clarify that. It's post-racial because it doesn't mean that these categories don't exist. But the fact is that we are all equal. And that common identity, I think, is an important sort of, achievement in making a break from the old, identitarian politics premised on race. Now, our position is that you cannot think about civil and political rights independent of social and economic rights because our history teaches us that a lot of these questions around seemingly exclusively political rights were over deep material struggles of inequality, economic disparity, of unequal opportunities. So in a sense, one has to think about the dialectical relationship between social and economic rights and civil and political rights. The problem is that for the longest time, people kept pushing for civil and political rights only, exclusively, often, in the interest of strategic intervention politically. And
political gain.
Political gain.
All right. On that note, Ashwin,
okay.
We'll continue straight after this break.
Sure.
Well, Vinaka, welcome back once again to For the Record. We're talking about Fiji's progress report on the human rights presented to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review in Geneva. And MIDA Chairman Ashwin Raj was part of the Fiji delegation, which was led by Attorney General and Minister for Justice, Ayasaid Kayum. Ashwin, before the break, you were talking about how civil rights and political rights are often at the forefront but the core of the problem really has been bread and butter issues. I take that on board, but you haven't really explained how this was brought forward in Geneva, because socioeconomic rights for the first time have been included in our constitution. However, there is also recognition of civil rights and political rights of Fijians.
You know, I think this is a fundamental discussion to be had. First of all, you know, the right to water, the right to housing, sanitation, the right to education, I cannot see how they can be devoid of political rights. They are essentially political, but the selective privileging of civil and political rights over these rights about materially equality is where the problem lies. Exactly because the question of political rights was a response to a particular kind of historical political conjuncture. It was very fashionable. 2000, 1987, you know, there was this kind of prominence given to civil and political rights. But there's been very little discussion in this country about the question of social and economic inequality. And the Constitution, you know, gives it that kind of attention exactly because of the recognition that these rights are inextricably woven into each other. One cannot extrapolate civil and political rights from social and economic rights. Our bone of contention is really the privileging of one set of rights over others.
And did the UN recognize this? Did the UN
absolutely
agree?
Absolutely, it is in line with the UN you know, principles. In fact, you know, Fiji was commended largely for the kind of investment it has taken, you know, in social and economic rights. And which is why I actually want to say that one has to see this kind of shift in the way the media thinks about rights as well. Even now, if you look at the mainstream media, including the social media, it's deeply saturated with this kind of anxiety over civil and political rights, with very little attention to social and economic rights. I think there needs to be a fundamental shift in the ways in which the media begins to think through the question of human rights. And the civil society organizations as well. And I think the constitutional framework provides for that. Yeah. So we need to materialize that.
All right. I understand you've been saying throughout the show that Fiji has been commended. There's a lot of recognition for the work that has been done. However, I do believe that there would be issues that the UN would still want Fiji to address. I understand there are some 137 recommendations that have been made for Fiji. It would be impossible for us to go through all 137, but there are 12 that we are compliant with, 98 that we have, well, the delegation has accepted. Describe to me the general overview of these recommendations and what we need to do from here.
They're fundamental things, you know, in any, you know, discourse on human rights. One is the legal infrastructure, whether it's there or not, so that we can enforce certain rights and so on and so forth. The other is to map these rights that have been written into law and materialize them against what's been provided in law. So in a sense, you cannot go to one specific meeting and say, look, we've achieved all the human rights sort of, you know, goals, because it's always a work in progress. What is absolutely needed is, and Fiji is going to be working towards the ratification of numerous conventions. We acknowledge the issue of police brutality and torture, and you know, we've talked about the various measures the state continues to take to you know, educate the police, the professionalization of the police, the gender training, you know, of the police, you know, so, you know, this is where rubber meets the road. It's all about now taking it to that other level where we can actually have a continuous culture of human rights.
What did you mean that the Fiji delegation acknowledged incidents of torture? I understand that you spoke about professionalism within the police, but what exactly was Fiji's explanation?
So,
Are we saying that it wasn't under the state's control? Are we saying that the state didn't know, or that there is an issue, there is an area that needs to be worked on? What is the explanation there?
Well, it's very clear. We didn't go there to paint a rosy picture of the state. We wanted to have an honest and a very critical assessment of the human rights landscape. We all have to face the fact that we do have incidences of brutality. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to be, speaking truth to power. Yet at the same time, I think it wasn't simply about acknowledging, it's about saying, well, what are we doing about it? And so the kinds of measures that have been taken to ensure that, the DPP is able to conduct its investigation independently.
Is that why the DPP director, Mr. Christopher Pride, was there to actually talk about what they're doing? The
independence of their office in terms of being able to conduct the investigations without any due influence from anybody. The continuous training of the police, is important, like any other ideological state apparatus.
All right, Ashwin, I'll have to stop you there. When we come back, more discussions about incidents of torture and investigations by the DPP's office. Welcome back to For the Record. We're talking about Fiji's presentations to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review on Human Rights, which was held in Geneva recently. Before the break, Ashwin, you were talking about Fiji acknowledging incidents of torture, and investigations are underway by the DPP's office. So what is the overall stand of the Fiji government on these incidents of torture, and what is the final outcome that Fiji would like to see?
Absolutely. Look, in no uncertain terms, the government absolutely condemns incidences of torture and brutality. And the Constitution, and particularly Section 11 of the Bill of Rights, which talks about freedom from cruel and degrading treatment, and Section 13, in fact, provides for the rights of arrested and detained persons. I think that's a very important section of the Constitution that we must take full cognizance of. The fact that the judges have, in certain cases, deemed confessions that have been made by detained persons in custody as inadmissible, again, is a very strong testament to the fact that any confession coerced out of detained people persons is unacceptable, inadmissible. In 2012, the police force introduced a pilot scheme for videotaping of police interviews. Now, this is an important step in terms of ensuring greater transparency and fairness in all these police procedures. The Police Act is going to be reviewed in 2015, which will ensure that there are strict procedures for custody at the police station, better guidelines for taking interviews. So all these steps are very, very important. I think it's important that the state is always honest, and it's important that you take responsibility and say, okay, we acknowledge these incidences, but the more important thing is, what are you doing about it? And I think that's where we need to focus a lot more. And, we also recognize the independence of the police, the independence of the DPP in carrying out their duties without any due influence.
You were in Geneva. You were present when Fiji made its presentation. Is the DPP's office confident that it has the independence to carry out these investigations against the police and to come up with an outcome which might see police officers end up in court? Are they confident that they have that independence?
The Director of Public Prosecutions was very emphatic and affirmed the independence of the office of the DPP, and I think you have his statements at your disposal, because I would not want to speak for him, except to say that in no uncertain terms, he did affirm the independence of the office and their commitment to justice for all.
All right, Ashwin, let's move to your field of expertise, and the reason that you were in Geneva, the Media Industry Development Authority. There's been a lot of talk about freedom of the media, freedom of expression, and the conduct of journalists post-elections, even pre-elections. The last periodic review that Fiji would have attended, there would have been issues about draconian decrees that inhibit freedom of media. When you went to Geneva, were you able to convince the UN that MIDA is pro-media and not anti-media?
You know, my intervention was really on the basis of responsibility. We wanted we do want a free, robust, but a responsible media. And you know, I had to you know, talk about the fact that the kinds of limitations that have been set out in the Constitution, they're justifiable limitations, which you know, sort of are in line with the decisions of the European Court on Human Rights. For instance, the limitations to the freedom of expression on the basis of hate speech. You know, and so and given our long history of racism and institutionalized racism at that, to me, the intervention on the issue of hate speech is important, given the fact that the social media is still saturated with, you know, hate speech. Again, is an important indication that you cannot have a free media that is going to be irresponsible. The issue about the regulation of the media once again came under discussion, and I had to remind people, and incidentally it was a question from the UK, that, you know, in fact the UK has a model of you know, self-audited you know, regulation, and the audit is actually done by the state. This is following the Leveson inquiry. So in a sense, why is it that this is permissible in UK and not seen as the state trying to muzzle media freedom? But in Fiji, on the other hand, there is this whole sort of kind of, you know, hoopla about the fact that this is another way in which the state is trying to tighten the noose on the media. I had to clarify that no journalists have been, you know, persecuted for the content of their report. In fact, we've been pushing for, you know, self-regulation. And you'd know that even in extreme instances, such as the one to do with hate speech, no fines were imposed, no imprisonment terms. You know, we seek retraction. So what I'm really looking for is a fundamental epistemic shift in the way we do things. It's not about imprisonment terms. It's not about fines. The only issue we had was one of ownership with a major newspaper in this country. It had nothing to do with its content, so of the reports and all of that. So one had to be very, very specific about this and disambiguate. The other thing was to let everybody know that the public emergency regulations were lifted. We had 450 journalists in the country covering the elections, both local and international. You know, I've been very, very particular about a responsible media, and that is something that is going to be a major preoccupation of MIDA. The issue really, Edwin, is about ethics and ethical journalism.
All right, one last question. I take on board what you said, but you have to agree that climate of self-censorship was created after 2006, and it has existed. And with the introduction of MIDA, there is a perception that MIDA is there, looking over journalists' shoulders, you know, observing what they do, and ready to pounce as if. But you keep saying that you want a responsible, free but responsible media. However, your perception is something else entirely.
I don't deal with perceptions. I deal with facts. I don't work with perception. You see, self-censorship is a self-imposed condition.
How does one come out of it?
I've actually said
how does one
they will have to come out of it.
How?
They will have to engage with MIDA on a series of training on defamation, contempt of court, so on and so forth, to see, you know, what are the limitations to freedom of expression. It's very, very simple. And, you know, we've been very proactive in terms of engaging the media. I've never entered a newsroom to say, hey, don't say this or don't say that. It is about exercising responsibility, and we have not gone out of our way to actually stop the media from doing its work. So in a sense, I take strong exception to any insinuation that somehow the other self-censorship is a problem of MIDA. No, it's not. I've actively encouraged the media to go ahead and do its work, and so they should, within the bounds of responsibility. And they are all very clearly stated in the media decree. Now, the media decree is a very important decree in the sense that it spells out the code of ethics, and this was a decree that was, borrowed verbatim from the previous, media law. So, in a sense, why are they now making this a state of exception? I can't see how you can deal with this industry without talking about ethics. It's extremely important.
All right, Ashwin, I'm sorry I must interrupt you, but we've run out of time. We'll be back after this short break. Welcome back to For the Record. We're speaking about Fiji's human rights record and our presentation to the Universal Periodic Review in Geneva. Ashwin, before the break, you were talking about self-imposed, self-censorship, as the word suggests, but keyword, Media Industry Development Authority. So in terms of development, what has MIDA done up to now to develop media in Fiji? Any trainings held, any workshops that are being planned?
Absolutely. Edwin, you'd recall the first training I had was on the media decree itself, so that people could acquaint themselves with the media code of ethics. I've had training on the Bill of Rights. Madam Shamim conducted that. It was a very useful workshop on the Bill of Rights. We need to do more of that, and the Constitution. We held training on reporting the elections. Now we're going to work with, hopefully with UNDP, on training the media on reporting the Parliament. I had meetings with the ILO, a very, very productive meeting, and they have indicated their strong interest in working with MIDA on training the media on labor rights. So, we have got a very strong development brief. Like I said before, it's not simply about suspending the economy of rights and instituting a series of penal liability. It's about developing the industry. The thing about media freedom is that it's a far more complex situation than simply the state persecuting journalists and tightening a noose on them. It is an industry. It is a profit-driven industry. And one has to think about the political economy behind media freedom. For instance, nobody wants to talk about the enormous power differentials in a newsroom between the publisher, the editor, and your ordinary journalist, in whose name the fight of freedom is fought. So the other thing was that there were numerous questions about the harassment of journalists who were critical of the state. Well, I had to say to them, death threats were in fact made against journalists who were deemed to be proponents of the state in Fiji. So, there's a completely different perception altogether. And so, people work with stereotypes. And particularly in human rights discourse, is always seen as the state as the perpetrator and the others as victims. I think human rights is a much more complicated business than that.
All right, let's finish off on the issue of media and freedom of media. But let's look at the entire UPR meeting, the entire session that was held on Fiji. Obviously, there are things that we still need to work on.
Yeah.
What are the priorities? What do we need to address urgently, or at least put on the top of the list?
Well, there are several things that need to be done in terms of our commitment to ratifying several conventions. I don't want to get into the details as yet. Strengthening the Office of the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission, working very closely with various institutions such as the police. The judiciary will be conducting its own training. So strengthening a lot of these institutions so that one can secure greater rights and freedom. So there's going to be a lot of work. This is continuous work. The other issue, of course, is the importance of constructive engagement. I cannot emphasize that enough, because for the longest time, the work of human rights has actually operated in a silo. right? It's compartmentalized. Somebody becomes an expert on human rights. Somebody has monopoly over human rights. Human rights is not a business of the state alone. Human rights is not a prerogative of the civil society alone. By virtue of the fact that we are all human beings, we are human rights advocates. And this is a message I want to send to everybody, to stop huffing and puffing and beating your chest and saying, I'm the doorkeeper when it comes to gender justice, or I'm the doorkeeper when it comes to media freedom. No, every human being, by virtue of the fact that they're humans, are human rights advocates. So the importance of constructive engagement between the state and the civil society and the wider community is extremely important. And we need to forge an ethic of engagement that is going to take every Fijian forward as far as securing greater rights and freedom and human rights and dignity is concerned.
What you've just said, is this linked to the recommendations, some of which require consultation? Is that what you're leading up to, the fact that there are issues that have been brought up in Geneva, issues that Fiji needs to work on, and which Fiji needs the cooperation of non-state entities and all stakeholders to move forward with? Is that what you're getting at?
Well, my intervention is situated by a certain kind of pragmatism, which is one, no man is an island. You can't achieve these things alone. You see, the civil society can go out and do all this kind of sort of, community education stuff, but it means very little without input from the state. The state can do its entire legal infrastructure and all of that, but you need people, you need organic intellectuals who are going to go educate the public. The state and civil society actually share so many of the concerns, whether it be gender-based violence, whether it be the right to education, so on and so forth. And these, indivisible rights actually mean that they have to work together. So there needs to be an ethic of engagement. But the other thing is that a lot of times it's not simply institutions. Society will have to change. We need to educate ourselves, and a lot of times we have to uneducate ourselves, to be able to unlearn so many of our prejudices, to then be able to sort of, go out and address some of these issues. We need to have human rights education. We need to have human rights training. And those who are advocates of human rights actually also need to think through how they can go out and effectively engage with the state and the other stakeholders.
Right, Ashwin, last question for tonight. What tangible differences or progress should we be able to show in the next 4 years when Fiji's turn comes up at the UPR?
I think I'm not going to spell it out because this is not a gaudy supermarket and I don't have a shopping list. But I do want to say that, in the area of human rights, beginning with the institutions that guarantee the human rights and dignity of all Fijians, the strengthening of those institutions, building greater transparency and accountability in those institutions, materializing our Bill of Rights, those are the key priority areas. Putting ordinary Fijians first, rather than just simply privileging some kind of elite discourse or lofty ideals pushed by donors or advanced liberal democracies. To us, the commitment is really the contract between the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the citizens of this country.
All right, with that, Ashwin, thank you very much for being part of the show tonight. That was For the Record tonight. Remember, if you have comments or questions, you can email us fortherecord@fbc.com.fj. We'll be back next Sunday. Until then, good night.